Welcome to another episode of Working the Word. In this series, we have been exploring the Gospel of John. We're getting close to the final point, to the point where the little navigator is going to say, "You have reached your destination."
A couple chapters to go now.
But really in this chapter, and we're working in chapter 19, starting from about verse 16. In this chapter, we get to the point where Jesus said, "I have arrived.
I'm done, it is finished."
It is finished. I have reached my destination. This is what I came for.
And you can see that, start seeing the ways that John has been sort of weaving up and leading us to this point. It's not this happened at the end, or it's not just here's some bits of the synoptic gospels left out. It's it is every bit as much part of the story of, so that you may believe.
And he's been taking us that direction. When we finished in our last episode, there was a little conversation between Pilate and the Jews. They were saying, "Away with him, away, crucify him."
They're getting into the Passover spirit, aren't they?
They are. And Pilate's, "Shall I crucify your king?" Which pushes them to the point, we have no king except Caesar.
I mean, to be fair, they've been pushing his buttons. He's pushing their buttons.
They've messed up his morning, and there'll be more to be delivered in the afternoon. But at this point, Jesus is delivered to them that he might be crucified. But the whole book of John has been bringing us to this point.
Yeah.
And maybe it's useful just to look back to the beginning.
Skim through a little bit.
And skim through. Right in chapter 1, we got to verse 11. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. When John the Baptist talks about Jesus later in the same chapter, he sees Jesus coming and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, the one taking away the sin of the world."
Which, originally probably wouldn't have made a lot of sense to them, but, we're winding up, we're in Passover. Jesus is about to do, John's really has put the dots together before he's writing this, but you can see how he's starting to seed some of these ideas.
And in chapter 2, very early in his ministry, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up." And John in his commentary says he was talking about the temple of his body. And then we've got this little conversation with Nicodemus, that as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, thus it's necessary for the Son of Man to be lifted up so that everyone believing in him may have eternal life.
It kind of sets up John's idea of, the crucifixion not as the final defeat, but as the final kind of victory sort of thing, that, that he's being lifted up and placed in a position of higher power, not, at his weakest moment.
And interestingly, this is spoken to Nicodemus, who will again appear
in this chapter.
And then Jesus talked about being the living bread come down from heaven. And the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh, just to hint at what's coming. And in chapter 7, they were seeking to take him. But no one laid hand on him because his hour had not yet come. But now his hour has come. They have taken hold of him.
And it's one of the ways that John almost sort of seems to mark time, not yet, not yet, not yet, now. And for the last couple of chapters, it's sort of been moving into his time has come. And it's sort of the prelude to the it is finished that we're going to get soon.
And all of these have been pointing us forward to this event. In the next chapter, Jesus talked to them, "When you shall have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and I do nothing from myself."
Which again is one of those ones that the disciples kind of realised what that meant later.
But he's put the groundwork in. And then in his conversation about the Good Shepherd, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. They didn't get it then, but they will now.
Or soon.
And he continued on, because of this the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it again. This commandment I received from my Father.
And you can kind of see echoes of that in the way that John talks about, when Jesus actually does die. You can see echoes of that authority and that, that I'm laying it down. It's no one's taking it from me.
And even in his conversation with Pilate, he had every opportunity to cozy up to Pilate.
And Pilate probably would have happily taken his side if for no other reason than that the Jews were, that the leaders at the time were.
And Jesus actually has had multiple opportunities.
Yes.
If he hadn't gone to the garden, if he had gone somewhere else that night, they would not have found him. But this was destiny.
And you can very much see that he is the one pushing forward to it. It's not, he's in no way running from it.
And John records Caiaphas. It's profitable that one man should die for the people and the whole nation should not perish. Didn't realise what he was doing. He was saying, for God so loved the world that whoever believed in him should not perish.
We get a little bit of a second level of that in a few verses' time, that someone unwittingly kind of declaring the gospel kind of thing.
And again, Jesus' conversation about a grain of wheat having fallen to the ground, it should die, it abides alone, but if it should die, it bears much fruit. And the repetition again, I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all to myself. So this is, in Jesus' mind, not the low point.
This is the lifting up.
This is the pinnacle. So, Jesus is handed over by Pilate.
And I think, there's a degree of just sort of, the chief priests are refusing, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him to them, that he might be crucified. Okay, it's done. Therefore they took Jesus. It's it's really simple. Mm-hmm. They've had a lot of back and forth, and now it's well, okay.
In the end, they get their choice, but they get more than they bargained for.
The other thing I find really, really interesting about John, particularly in comparison to the others, is we've had, several chapters on that night before, the hours. We've had a lot of interplay. This is about basically the crucifixion. That's it. It's a couple verses and we're done, almost. That John gives us the very most basic summary. Now, whether that's, his readers are well aware of crucifixion and really don't need the graphic details, or whether it's just that isn't the important part of the story to John. We get very, very little. We don't get anything about Simon of Cyrene. We don't get, we barely reference the thieves on either side. We've got, Tim with two others, but that's it. There's no mocking of the crowd and leaders. We don't have the 3 hours of darkness. We don't have the torn veil. We don't have the centurion's testimony. We don't even have the, my God, why have you forsaken me? None of that is in
John's Gospel. That John is there with the key basic facts. That he was nailed to a cross, and on the side there are two others, and we're not even told too much about them, except that he's
in the middle.
Well,
he's kind of the focal point. He's the one that the priests really want to make an example of.
Pilate actually gets a little bit more time than the crucifixion.
And we've had a lot more of kind of Pilate's story here. John gives us a lot more detail about this next part than any of the other Gospels do.
Now, each Gospel records that there is a sign over Jesus' head. They don't have it quite word for word what was on the sign.
But there's also a really good chance that John was actually there. as opposed to the others who seem to more been collecting accounts. It's because of John that we know it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, which are kind of the three powerhouse languages of the time.
And there are people from all over the world there because it's Passover.
So essentially we have Jesus is proclaimed to the whole world as the king by a Gentile.
Just the irony of it.
So we've kind of had Caiaphas unintentionally kind of, giving Jesus, getting it but not getting it. And here we have Pilate, who it almost seems just out of, he has to give a charge of something. And this one's going to annoy the religious leaders who've been annoying him, so let's go with it. But, in the three languages so that everybody will understand, he's just proclaimed to the world that this is the King of the Jews.
And perhaps despite himself, God is using him.
They weren't too pleased with that, though.
Well, people were reading it. As the prisoners were taken out, the centurion went ahead and there was a sign indicating what these people had been convicted of.
And they'd often actually lead them through the streets in a fairly long procession. Partly, he has to carry his own beam, and so partly it's part of it. But there's also they're supposed to lead the person through the streets with the charge in front of them so that there's the maximum possibility for if anybody can speak up and say, I have new evidence or this shouldn't happen, that, it can be taken to trial. They can go back and re-examine the new evidence so that, there's kind of a last final shot. But I don't think they're particularly concerned with that this time. A, they haven't shown a lot of regard for trial protocol so far, and B, we're sort of on a time schedule. It's.
And even Roman law said you shouldn't execute the same day as conviction. So
they're having to break a lot of rules here.
To keep the rules, yes. So the chief priests who have been up early, who wouldn't go into his house, feel disrespected. They want him to change it. Don't write the King of the Jews, but he said, I'm the King of the Jews.
I kind of love Pilate at this point. That, there's a lot of people that have sort of suggested that he was strong on the wrong points and if he'd been strong on a different point. But realistically, at this point, him being able to just go, what I've written is what it is, it sort of allowed that testimony to go out, even if that's what his intention wasn't actually. And that, they've pushed their luck far enough. And that Pilate is no, I'm still actually the one who's calling the shots here.
And you've messed up my morning. You've dragged me out of bed early. I'm going to mess up the rest of your day. And despite himself, he's a witness.
And, we get a very, very brief dive back into him much later in the chapter. But other than that, we've kind of just come to the end of Pilate's narrative, that we've had a long, since verse 28 of 18, we've kind of, until now, we've sort of almost been in Pilate's narrative. But this is kind of the point at which we leave Pilate, that, the Jewish leaders are sort of trying to change the details.
And it's not going to happen.
And Pilate just sort of sets himself firm and...
Draw a line, and we move on. There's some soldiers. And it looks like there's 4 soldiers appointed to the cross.
Well, again, this is one of the things that we get mostly from John as opposed to any of the other Gospels, that there's 4. There's a specific name for it that is used. I can't remember what it is. But, yeah, when somebody is delivered to be crucified, there is a squadron of 4 soldiers that's responsible.
And it's obvious there because they split his clothes into 4 piles.
2 each soldier apart, so, yeah.
Except for the tunic, which has got no seams in it. And they say, well, I guess our expression, let's toss for it.
And like there's in being seamless, it does give it some value, but there is also suggestions that a seamless woven garment is something associated with priestly garments.
Okay.
That it's the link is more tenuous in sort of the Old Testament, but particularly looking at some of the Talmudic writings, the woven seamless garment is a priestly thing.
And not supposed to be torn. I wonder, the high priest did tear his garment in one of the Gospels. But
it
wasn't John.
I think it was Matthew.
Yeah.
I might be wrong, but...
So let's cast lots, whose it'll be. And in doing so, they fulfilled what the scripture said. They divided my garments among them.
And John has a particular preoccupation, particularly in this sort of section, as to, this happened to fulfill this, this happened to fulfill this. And he's sort of really explicit about, because, in the end, his end goal is, this is written so you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. So he's pointing out some of these links really explicitly.
And he's going to have Jesus note that everything has been fulfilled before he died. And then John looks a different direction.
I actually found this passage really interesting. In comparing, I found some things I hadn't seen before. Now, we've kind of almost got a contrast here that we've got the 4 soldiers and the 4 women. And you've kind of, it feels like he's designed it to be that way, but almost all of the Gospels mention 4 women. Mm-hmm. And sort of patching it together, here we have... Mary, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And almost all of the Gospels present something similar. Now, we think the wife of Clopas is the mother of James the Lesser and Joseph, which is mentioned in one of the others. But sort of comparing Matthew and Mark, the Salome seems to be the wife of Zebedee, and in the other Gospels, Salome is there in place of Mary's sister. So you've got Mary and Salome, wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, which sort of suggests that Salome is Mary's sister, Salome is married to Zebedee, and James and John are the sons of Zebedee. So Jesus actually could be first cousin to John, which would explain why... kind of explain some of those dynamics and kind of throw some interesting questions in. But, that John and his mum and his aunt are among the people that are hanging around, essentially.
Mm. Interesting.
Which also, we get to Jesus having seen his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by. Now, John doesn't actually sort of reference him or his brother or potentially his mother, no direct reference to those people. Says to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Now, it's interesting because Mary does actually have other kids. And he's entrusting her to John, possibly because her other sons weren't yet believers. And they're not going to be particularly comforting to her in this time, but also... it's her nephew. It's not just sort of a random, can you look after her? It kind of adds a layer here.
And some commentators actually want to turn around so that he's entrusting him to her.
Mm. But particularly some of the ones where, Mary is a much more significant figure in an ongoing way within the beliefs and the understanding of the church. And to be honest, I think they were both there for each other at this point. Mm-hmm. That, particularly if he's her nephew, but just being the disciple that is loved by Jesus, his family is going to be dear to him as well.
And the fact that from that hour he took her to himself, looked after. From what we can work out, she went through to Ephesus, where he was the pastor many years later.
And I imagine there's been a lot of chats between John and Mary in the preceding years.
And having done that, a testamentary disposition, as it were.
That he's hanging on the cross in incredible pain, and his concern is to make sure that his mother is cared for.
Mm-hmm. And at this point, he knows now that all things have been accomplished that the scripture might be fulfilled.
Which again is kind of interesting in that it's a spin that we don't, the other Gospels kind of bring this a different way. And the way that John gives it, again, we've got that sense of fulfillment, but that, Jesus is understanding of that in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not just I'm out of strength. That's as much as I can do. It's
complete.
And he knows it.
We have reached our destination. The word accomplished here is the same word that's translated finished in a couple of verses' time.
Mm. And the other thing that I find is kind of really interesting here, just this sort of slight play that, he knew that this was, but he says, I thirst. Here's the living water and he thirsts.
And I think John is reflecting his real humanity.
Mm.
That it's not like he's some sort of deity without needs. This is real humanity.
And particularly, that's something that John picks up a little bit in the next section as well, but even just thinking back to some of his conversation with a woman at the well, so you'll never thirst again, but as the lamb for the sins, there's almost a sense at which he understands that thirst just a little bit. Yes, there is human, but I think there are potentially multiple layers here.
And I see it as an act of kindness, a vessel full of sour wine had been set there. And the humanity of one of the soldiers who actually doesn't say, oh, well, who cares? But actually offers it to him. The other Gospels have had him refusing drugged wine and gives him something to drink.
The other thing I think is sort of noteworthy here, in that in the other Gospels it talks about, they put a sponge on a stick and gave it to him, mm-hmm. or offered it to him. Here it's put on a stalk of hyssop. And, it's Passover weekend. Hyssop was the branch that they used to cover the door frames in the original Exodus.
So when they took the blood and painted it on the door, that was done with? That was done with
hyssop.
Hyssop.
And John is the only one who brings that out, which to me feels like there's links that he's trying to draw in there, because they're literally celebrating Passover.
Supposed to be anyway. And when Jesus takes it, he has something just to wet his lips. He says, "It has been finished. It is accomplished. We have arrived. This is the destination."
And that's kind of it.
And it's not, I have been defeated.
Mm.
I have completed the mission. At this point, he yields up the Spirit. It's not that someone's taken it from him.
And it's the same sort of verb that's been used a couple of times, like being delivered over to Pilate, being delivered over to be crucified, being delivered over from Judas, I think was the first one. Judas who is delivering him up. It's the same kind of idea of
Again, he is in control. It's that verse, I have power to lay down my life.
Mm.
And here's the point at which it happens.
Which is kind of again, the next section we don't actually get in any of the other Gospels either. But it's very critical here that John says, this is the point at which he yielded up his spirit.
When things have been finished, completed, accomplished, that we can talk about Jesus' work being finished. It's not partial. It's not incomplete. His work is finished.
And from a practical point of view, we're about to go into the Roman soldiers making sure that he was actually dead. And so, he has to have yielded up his spirit first before that can happen.
So really it fits with the verse at the beginning of John, that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. This is not a moment of darkness. When Jesus says it is finished, it's more like a triumph.
And particularly in the way that John leans forward into, the crucifixion. It's never spoken of in a tragic kind of way. It's leaning into glory.
Well, his expression has been, the one who sent me, the Father who sent me. He has come to earth on a heaven-sent mission.
And he when he talks about being glorified, essentially, this is it.
He's the Passover lamb. This is Passover. In fact, at 3:00 in the afternoon, that's when the lambs are being killed. And here is Jesus dying on the cross. And it raises the concept that this is now the beginning of a new Exodus. That the one out of Egypt only foreshadowed a much greater.
Well, it was kind of involving them in the story so they would understand what was to come. That, yes, it was saving them, but it was also kind of pointing forward. And a lot of the feasts and festivals that they celebrated on a yearly basis were to point them forward to kind of this.
And from John's perspective, it's almost like Jesus being lifted up on the cross is being lifted up as a king. At a coronation, he is now crowned. But while Jesus has completed his mission, for those who put him there is something incomplete.
And that there's sort of some little inconvenient things that have to be taken care of, like no one's allowed to hang there over a Sabbath or a feast day.
And that's going to begin in just a
few
short hours. So we need them off. We were in such a hurry to get them on there, and now we want them off there.
Now, typically, he kind of says that you could kind of heave yourself up a little bit to be able to continue breathing. So they would break the legs so that they couldn't keep doing that, which would sort of speed up the process. But, when they get to Jesus, they don't need to. But it's sort of explaining here that, like, he's setting us up because he'll, this fulfills this and this. But again, there's a level of detail here that John gives us that is more insight into it than the other Gospels have.
And in fact, they're asking Pilate, number one, for the legs to be broken and that they might be taken away. It's almost like these are trash.
In some ways, like, there's some of the really early thinking that's slightly foreign that's crept in a bit, I suspect, in that often they didn't actually bury people in the ground because it would defile the ground. So, that they would either be left out so that the animals could deal with it and...
I read vultures would come. They certainly couldn't be put in a regular cemetery.
Yeah.
Or just chucked on the rubbish tip.
Yeah. And
the same outcome probably.
And ultimately, this is in a really prominent position. Like they've tried to make a really big example of him, and now they have to destroy the evidence really, really quickly. And again, this is the last little sort of look in that Pilate gets, but actually, no, we get one more, but...
Yeah, they come to Jesus and discover that he's already dead, so they don't break his legs.
And I think there's an element here that the reason that John brings this out where the other Gospels don't is that, if he's dealing with Gnosticism, this idea that he was a real man with a real body, when his side was pierced, it wasn't, he wasn't like a hologram or something. When his side was pierced, the physical effects of being dead were obvious.
And lots of people have tried to bring something out of water and blood. I think his point is simply that when Jesus died, he was a real man really dying. As evidenced by.
The other thing that I find is interesting that we've got this, really detailed in some places and sketchy in other places narrative. And then John specifically steps out at this point and says, the one having seen this has borne witness, his testimony is true. And
I was there.
And he knows that he's speaking truth that you might believe. We've kind of got, has seen it, borne witness, his testimony is true. He knows he is speaking truth so that you might believe. He's not leaving any room for gaps here.
And we're right back to his theme that he's going to repeat again in the next chapter. His whole purpose is...
So that you might believe.
So that you might believe.
And, for him, it is utterly critical to take a step out and almost break the fourth wall here in terms of telling this story, that, it's not just this thing happened. It's this thing happened and this is what you need to understand from this.
And this is why I'm telling you this.
And then he goes back into his, this took place to fulfill.
Not one bone of him will be broken. And it's interesting to chase that one back. And the other one is they will look on the one they have pierced. And Zechariah talks about that. But the not one bone of him being broken is...
It's a Passover thing again.
It's a Passover reference. And this is the Exodus 12 reference. I think there's another one in Exodus 29, is it?
I don't remember.
And then there's another one in Numbers. But here's the Exodus 12 one. This is when it's instituted, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. And he talks about it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house. And you shall not break any of its bones.
Which, originally probably just seemed like one of the ritual laws that they had to... But it looks like John has taken some time and started seeing some of the, I see the connections. So this connected with this, and this didn't happen so that the things lined up.
Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. None of his bones are broken. Passover time, put it all together.
And even in the other Gospels where it talks about the Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, or whatever, it's actually mixing two languages. Again, that sort of quoting back and bringing back things. John has chosen not to include that here, but he's very, very much linking it back to how this fulfills the story that God has given them as to their salvation all the way through. Now, they've been getting little glimpses of it ahead of time, and this is kind of him going, this is it. This is actually what that was all pointing to.
And really, with relationship to the Exodus from Egypt, the death of a lamb is, how does that fit with that story, except that it was part of the story? But now we can look back and say, that was foreshadowing.
And even things like, the blood of the lamb being sprayed, used with the hyssop to cover the doorposts and keep that family safe. There's all sorts of layers that can be brought out there that just kind of seem like a ritual otherwise.
And so now we have to deal with this body.
I kind of find this passage actually really interesting because here we've got Joseph of Arimathea, who's been concealed because of fear of the Jews. Now, if there's ever a time you're going to be afraid of the Jews, this kind of would, if they've just killed the guy that you were sort of secretly following, this is not typically the time you'd expect someone to speak up and go, actually, I'm a follower. But he goes to Pilate and asks if he can take the body away, and Pilate, go for it. I rather suspect that Pilate much preferred for somebody else to deal with and to have to deal with the leaders again. But we've also got Nicodemus, which John takes great pains to point out, Nicodemus, the one that came to him by night.
The one where he said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man will be lifted up.
And you kind of wonder whether Nicodemus is now starting to feel to get some of those connections.
It's connected for these two men.
And we've also had just one little glimpse of Nicodemus in the middle where the Pharisees were getting all... one of their sessions where they were being a little bit lax with the law, and Nicodemus kind of points out, guys, aren't we actually also?
Aren't we out of order?
And I feel like this is the flipping point. Like, this is the point at which Nicodemus goes, they have gone too far. I am not with them. Like, you know, two people who have been afraid of the Jews, who at this point, you know, his own disciples at this point, for the most part, are scattering in fear. And these two men who've been hiding in fear of, you know, are no longer afraid.
And in fact, this fear of the Jews is going to come up again in the next chapter. The disciples on the first day of the week
are still afraid.
Are afraid of the Jews. They're behind locked doors.
That, you know, we might be next. And yet these two people who have been sort of lying a little bit low are willing to come out of the woodwork at this point because this is too far and you know, they're not going to abandon him now.
And it's interesting, this occurs just 2 verses after John's statement that I've spoken this so that you might believe.
It kind of almost gives this indication that at this point, so that, like, you know, that it's been fulfilled in them. They believe. I mean, also, I don't know whether he managed to sort of catch a late open merchant or something, but a mixture of myrrh and aloe, about 100 litres. That's 34 kilos. 34 kilos of spice and, like, you know, perfume and whatever the things that, you know, are used to do the burial. 34 kilos.
Obviously, these two men have means.
Oh, clearly. And it's not as specific here, but there's insinuations in some of the other gospel that one of them is actually the owner of the tomb as well.
Yeah, well, that's the next thing we need, isn't it? We've got a body, we've got it all wrapped up and spiced, but we need somewhere to put it.
And we need somewhere close because it's starting to get dark and we need to get back. The other thing that I actually think is interesting there is that they've essentially willingly, on the day of Passover, made themselves ceremonially unclean. Like, as far as the Jews are concerned, like the leaders wouldn't go into Pilate's house so that they would still be clean. And you've got these two men who are willing to make themselves ceremonially unclean and having to delay their...
Yeah, so they can still do Passover, but they've got to wait a month.
And I kind of find that interesting. Like, you know, particularly we know that Nicodemus is involved in, was, I'd say at this point that relationship might be gone, but was involved in, you know, the high council, the leaders.
There comes a time when a person has to stand up and say, this is the side that I'm on. You know, they've laid low. You know, Nicodemus came by night. Joseph's been flying under the radar.
But it is now time.
It is time. There comes a time to make a decision.
And for them, it's now.
For them, the decision, I have decided to follow Jesus. It's out there for all to see.
And I mean, in the other Gospels, we get a bit more of an idea that the women were sort of hanging around and we don't sort of see much here. We don't, like, once John has been asked to take care of his mother, then it's kind of we don't hear much more from them.
Except we're going to see Mary Magdalene again.
Yeah, in the next chapter. But we don't see them at this point. So it's kind of, you know, his own followers and family are gone.
But God has provided. Oops.
We've also got the specific reference to, you know, a garden in the place, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid.
And garden can be a grove, an orchard. Gethsemane, where he prayed, is a garden.
But you've also got, particularly with a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid, is kind of almost an allusion to a royal burial. This is, you know, that he's been given a burial of honour.
Howbeit temporarily.
Yes. 34 kilos of spice are about to go to waste, but, you know.
It's a good way to go. And so, again, because it's the preparation day,
And
that's a term that applies to the day before the Sabbath, but then John calls it of the Jews. They're so head up about that, but they've been happy to be lax.
well, the other thing is, quite a few times along the way, John has made specific reference to, the feast of the Jews or the festival of the Jews. So that this is, he's sort of, again, a little bit anchoring it in place that, we're in the preparation day. That's this is part of the Jewish routine. And this is where we are in that space. And, because if it was an ordinary day, then yes, by nightfall. But because it's preparation day, there's extra things that have to be done. We have to be back a little bit earlier.
And it doesn't matter if justice doesn't happen.
That there is, the Passover being able to function precludes this law. And so you've got different laws that cancel out each other at different circumstances. So we're being given a little bit of context here, I think. And because the tomb was near, they couldn't kind of go for a tomb that was a little bit more out of the city. They needed something close.
And so that's where they put him.
And that's it. That's all.
And that's all John says about it.
We don't get anything for a couple of days.
We've had chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 and 19.
Of sort of the night before the morning.
Covering a period of a little more than 24 hours.
Yes. And then nothing until Sunday.
We know nothing from John about the next day. Now, truthfully, none of the Gospels
tell us much. The other thing I wonder is, John has just been given care of Jesus' mother. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wonder whether at that point his priority was more caring for a grieving mother than sort of, making note and whether the process of caring for that grieving mother was something that was almost a keeping private, not private in the sense of massive secrets, but in that, in terms of her grieving, it is her time. He is grieving also, that it's not necessarily something that they have to tell everybody about, the nitty-gritty details.
And the rest of the disciples are grieving also. Mm. Nobody feels like singing, praising. It's a day to be forgotten.
And I mean, the suggestion in the other Gospels is that, they head back to the upper room, which if it is the same upper room that has been, it's still going to have all the smells and potentially stuff on the table left over from the Last Supper. There's going to be a whole bunch of sort of sensory.
So we've got a whole lot that's not known, but God lets them have this black time before the Great Awakening.
And even, when we looked at Lazarus and Jesus came and he didn't just sort of come and just stop crying, I'm going to fix it. He took some time and sat with them in their human emotions. And I think God's giving them space for those human emotions here. And
so that they are ready for what's to come.
Because if he was, if it was like a jack-in-a-box and, you put him in and he just sort of came straight back to life, there's no way of kind of processing it, or maybe he didn't die, or whereas John has been very specific that he was human, he died,
he was speared,
and then he came back.
And he's been well and truly wrapped up.
Mm-hmm. They've gone through, as far as we can tell from John, all of the necessary burial preparations. The other Gospels suggest it was a bit incomplete, but as complete as you can do when you've got limited time.
And the other Gospels talk about a big stone. John doesn't talk about that big stone.
It's not important. Other than we've, the beginning of the next chapter, she sees that the stone is removed, but that's it.
And so there is something exciting to come in the next chapter.
And John's eager for you to get there, I think.
But we're not going to rush.
No.
So in our next episode, we're going to jump into John chapter 20. And the question of what happens next. And we hope that you can join us then on the next episode of Working the Word, Exploring the Gospel of John.